Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast. My name is Matt Wood, and this is episode 63. Today is part 7 and the conclusion of my series on the California Wine Association. This episode is titled The Wine Tasters. If you stuck around this long, I hope you enjoyed it. Today we'll discuss some of the winemakers, blenders, and tasters of the CWA, those responsible for what was actually in the consumer's glass. The CWA was run like a real business of the time, and so much of what we have are those business records, but I want to try and piece together a little about the other side of the business, the people, their palates, and how the wine was made. Before we start, I'd like to let you know there is a Patreon you can donate to if you'd like to help me keep telling wine stories ad-free. If you don't want to or can't, that's okay too. Maybe you could tell a friend who would have an interest in listening also. Thanks. Here we go. I want to start with Ben May again, who we heard about a few episodes ago. I'll reiterate some of his words about the wineries of the time. I think something to remember about May was that he was most likely pretty representative of the winemakers and the so-called country wineries. Skilled in making good wine, but mostly anonymous in the grand scheme of things. Quote, "In those days, the wineries had dirt floors. At Fresno, one man did nothing but scatter sand all day to keep the floors dry. Sometimes lime was mixed with the sand to keep the floor smelling sweet. Tanks were all wood and spaced farther apart than those today in order to permit passage of mules and carts when pomace was being removed. Electric lighting was non-existent. Outside the winery building, kerosene lanterns were used. Inside, only candles were used as they were considered safer. All pumps and engines were powered by steam. Sherry was baked a little differently at the Fresno winery than it is today. Underneath the sherry tanks in what was actually the basement, wood fires were kept burning, which maintained the proper heat throughout the entire baking room. During crushing, 60 men worked at this winery. All grapes were hauled by teams to the winery. One year the teams waited from Saturday until Monday while the grapes were being crushed." Unquote. The first year May worked for the CWA in Fresno, the winery produced about 2 million gallons of wine and 1 million of brandy. He made 20 cents an hour plus room and board. By 1904, he was up to $75 a week plus room and board, which he considered pretty good. As he tells it, wine was generally shipped in 5, 10, 25, or 50-gallon barrels. We've presented the CWA as a pretty buttoned-up organization, and I think they were. But in 1908, when they leased Leland Stanford's gigantic Vina vineyard in Tehama County, the hiring was not great. Vina was around 56,000 acres at the time, with a vineyard covering about 4,000 of those, among the largest in the state. The new winemakers they had working there filled every fermenter to the top with grapes, and then quit when they saw the fermentation starting to foam and bubble and push grapes and stems and juice everywhere. May was sent up at once to fix it. He was processing around 30,000 gallons a day at the winery and made 500,000 gallons there that year. After harvest, he was called back. Apparently the vineyard and winery, with their close proximity to the Sacramento River, was known as a breeding ground for malaria. Post-Prohibition, May would work for fruit industries that we talked about last episode. Those first few years, they would only have the winemaker on staff at harvest time. Once harvest time ended, the winemaker was out of a job. Henry Lackman and A.R. Morrow were among the most important wine men of the CWA. They were the chief tasters and blenders, even making the final decision on any wines the CWA purchased or bottled. They weren't the only ones, and frankly, we don't know all of their names or stories. Some, like Ben May, got their name out there and talked to the newspaper, and now they live on in history. There were some, like Charles Ash, who we learned about. He was in charge of distilling all of the wine Louis Wetmore saved from San Francisco cellars. The wine that was sloshing around in a giant basement because of a clogged-up drain with chunks of burnt-up barrels floating on the top and the hoops of those barrels at the bottom. He'll make an appearance here later. There was also Jack Hanlon, who made the light, semi-sweet, high SO2 claret-style red wine that was beloved by the Italian immigrants of New Orleans for Lackman and Jacoby. We don't know much about him, but apparently his wine made the New Orleans water much more pleasurable and safe to drink. A worthy tasting opponent to Lackman was Charles Carpy, who we discussed way back in episode 1 of this series. He owned Greystone Cellars, and his firm made some of the finest wines in California. The two men considered themselves the 1A and 1B of wine tasters. They were both the 1A in their minds. Henry Lackman was born in Weaverville in Trinity County, California in 1860. He attended school in San Francisco and then Oakland. Upon graduation, he went to work for his father at S. Lackman & Co., along with his brother Arthur. With the incorporation of the CWA, Henry became one of its greatest assets. He was an original partner and stockholder, holding as much in the company as any man at the beginning, and sat on the first board of directors. Lackman and Carpy would both be California representatives at the 1915 Pan-Pacific Exposition in San Francisco. Most days, Lackman worked out of the Kohler and Froling building that was the CWA headquarters. A 3 million gallon cellar, as well as his office and lab, were all located there. In these days, it was his word alone for the purchasing, grading, and blending of wines. Varietal wines and district blends were separated out. Lackman would price the wines based on what he perceived as their quality and make his blends to fit styles and price points. In the beginning, his disdain for chemical analysis was legendary, but we'll see how he softened on this later. It was said he could identify grape and sometimes district blind, picking a Santa Clara wine out of a blind lineup and being slightly disappointed in himself that he couldn't place it to a region within the valley, is a story sometimes told. He retired from the CWA in 1901 and in 1906 purchased the Palmdale estate in Mission, San Jose. There's much more about the history of Palmdale in episode 29. He would also be a partner in the Molten Hill Winery and Vineyard in Cloverdale. His knowledge and contributions to wine would earn him the Chevalier of the Legion of Honor by the Republic of France. Perhaps the most unusual aspect of Lackman was that he was never known to drink wine, fearing it would dull his sense of taste. Charles Ashe would describe him as, quote, short and stocky in stature, he had a good sense of humor. He was most unreliable in desk work and correspondence, but oh, what a taster he was, unquote. In 1902, Lackman wrote a monograph on the manufacture of California wines on behalf of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It was included along with writings from H.W. Wiley, who was the leading person behind the Pure Food and Drug Act. It was the current chief of the Bureau of Chemistry for the Department of Agriculture. We'll talk much more about Wiley in a future episode, but suffice to say you've probably encountered the echoes of his work today. Maybe you're happy that your coffee wasn't made up of mostly sawdust, burnt beans, and charred seeds ground up and brewed, or that the milk you used wasn't watered down, thickened with plaster of Paris, and preserved with formaldehyde, or wondered why your oat milk is called oat beverage. This is all Wiley. A concern of Wiley's was the naming of wines. He hoped producers would start allowing their wines to stand on their own merits without using names like Chablis, Sauterne, Claret, or Burgundy, what are usually called generics. This practice, of course, continued in force long after Wiley and is still possible today with the grandfathering in of some labels. The CWA, for the most part, tended to give their wines proprietary names like La Loma, Wautoki, Greystone, or Hillcrest. The wines would be described as fine Burgundy, good old sherry, good light hock, and finest old Cabernet Claret, respectively. But at least consumers could ask for wine by the proprietary name. It was a start. What prompted him was that some American wines were excluded from medals at the 1900 Paris Exposition due to using European regional names. Wines were relabeled in the end. Some just put the word type after the European name, so you had a bunch of Chablis type, Burgundy type, Chianti type, and so on. Wiley was about to conduct the largest and most in-depth chemical assessment of American wines, using an additional bottle of all the wines submitted to be judged during the exposition. He does note in the intro, quote, "In fact, the chief part of the viticultural interests in the United States is found in California, so that often in speaking of American wines, California wines are understood by implication to be meant," unquote. Again, we'll get to Wiley's larger story in another episode, but Lackman's part here was to be writing as the voice of the winemaker and presumably the largest manufacturer of wines in California. Lachman starts in right away at what he takes to be unfair treatment of California wines at the recent tasting, basically accusing the French of being scared of American wines. Quote, "There is no question that the wine produced in California comes nearer to the European product than that produced in any other country in the world. We are convinced of this by the action of the jury at the Paris Exposition in putting out of competition all California wines bearing labels designating their types which the French considered as imitations, although they had allowed these same labeled wines to enter into competition for the last 20 years and until the Exposition of 1900. The writer's earliest recollection of medals being awarded for California wines is the Vienna Exposition of 1876." Unquote. The improvements to California wines he attributes to taking a more scientific approach over the last 8 years, as well as using more of the foreign varieties like Cabernet, Mataro, and Carignan. This really means using everything but Mission usually. Phylloxera and its devastation were on everyone's mind, but Lachman hoped that soil, temperature, exposures, water, frosts, and elevation would be taken into account when replanting occurred, and that varieties suited for specific conditions would be put in the ground. He runs through a typical harvest schedule, with it starting around August 15th or 20th in Fresno, and sometimes going nearly to Christmas if it was a cold year, or the second or even a third crop was available, but more often until the end of October. As harvest was getting close, they would gather bunches into a flour sack, no Ziploc bags invented yet, squeezing the berries and draining them into a glass or tin cylinder, sometimes a piece of pipe with a plug in the end if it was just the farmer out there testing. The saccharometer would be dropped in, and once this was reading about 24 degrees balling, bricks is the term you'll hear more often now, they were ready to pick. He gives us a great look into the lives of the laborers in the California Central Valley that I've never seen from this time. It's not a portrait altogether different than one from, say, Steinbeck 35 years later, or even now, maybe. Quote, "Gangs of men, Chinese, Indians, Serbians, boys, and often women proceeded to pick the bunches, collecting them in boxes holding from 50 to 60 pounds. The price paid the gatherer is based on the size of the crop and upon the season. Should a man be able to fill a box from 2 vines, which is very good picking, he is paid at the rate of $1 per ton. Should the crop be short and it takes more vines to fill a box, the price is often raised as high as $2 per ton. At this rate, the pickers average $1.50 to $2 a day. They board themselves, generally traveling from place to place with their wives and children. Each picker is given a number which he marks on each box he gathers. Most of the vineyards are set out in rows 8 feet apart, one row missing in every 20, which gives avenues about 16 feet wide through which the wagons pass and gather the boxes of grapes from the pickers. As each picker delivers a box to the driver, he is given a tag in exchange. These tags are turned into the boss contractor or superintendent who works the gangs, and the amount is paid. The pickers have to supply their own blankets and pay 50 cents daily for their meals, sleeping quarters being provided." Unquote. It's worth remembering that Lachman would work with more vineyards at the time than anyone else. Hundreds of vineyards throughout the state and thousands upon thousands of acres. If the winery wasn't connected to the vineyard, the grapes would be shipped in the boxes from the nearest depot to the correct winery. The thicker skinned and less valuable grapes like Fresno Muscats would be, quote, "dumped from the boxes into the cars, frequently on flat cars in the same manner as gravel is loaded." Unquote. Years later, about 1916, the CWA would experiment with harvesting with tractors in this area to try and help cover some of the ground of the 3,000-acre Watoki vineyard. They found them not up to the task yet. It was much the same in the more coastal dry wine districts. Quote, "In the Bay counties, the grapes are gathered in the same manner as in the sweet wine districts, but the deliveries are generally made in wagons direct to the wineries. There are some Indians who travel with their women and children, and Chinese among the grape gatherers, but the majority of the laborers are white. Usually the people in the immediate neighborhood participate, as do those who have preempted land in the mountainous districts, who travel down to the farming sections in harvesting time, beginning with the picking of cherries, following with the peaches and pears, then the hops and prunes, and lastly the grapes, which affords them steady employment from June to about November. They earn from $1.50 to $2 each day, which is about the same as the pay in Fresno County, and generally sleep in tents, camping out, unquote. A breakdown of common grapes at the time is given. Many are the usual suspects. Some quick highlights: Zin, Mataro, Carignan, Grenache, Petit Syrah, Becklin, Cabernet Sauvignon, and Franc, Merlot, Barbera, Mondouse, Golden Chasselas, Sauvignon Blanc, and Vert, Riesling and Grey Riesling, Colombard, Berger, Mission, Black Pinot, Rosa de Peru, and Tokay. As always, those are the names given at the time. Some go by different names now. Most everything in the wineries was done by gravity as much as possible, and it really doesn't look too much different than a small winery today. Grapes raised up and then dumped into the crusher, its corrugated roller set to just crush the berries, and then onto a destemmer. Grapes were normally destemmed, but if the stems were dry and woody, they would ferment with them. Fermenters would be filled about 2/3 full, and within about 2 days, they would expect fermentations to start. The temperature and sugar level was taken 3 times a day, with the usual fermentation lasting 5 to 7 days. It's reiterated that they want uniformly ripe bunches without damage or unripe or raisined berries. He wanted a smooth, consistent fermentation and found those with damaged or uneven fruit like I described could go lactic easily and then need to be distilled. In his opinion, too many tried to blend away this flawed wine only to wreck a larger batch. Quote, "Every gallon of poor wine loses a consumer, and it takes time to remove prejudice. There is no manufacturing business that can give satisfaction where inferior material is worked in." California grapes, in his mind, were as balanced naturally as those of France, Germany, and other wine-producing countries, needing nothing else. Wines are compared to a child in that they need to be raised and watched, and that you can't be careless. He advises to watch against temperature and overworking the wine, and that casks and tanks should be scrupulously clean. Caution was given about using barrels that contained poor wine to then store high-quality wine. Lachman favored fermentations of under 5,000 gallons when possible for his quality dry wines. Usually a combination of punch downs and pump overs would be used to extract tannins and color. He gives directions for making piquette from the pomace of the red grapes. This would usually be distilled into fortifying brandy. Afterwards, the pomace would be then sent to their cream of tartar works or other byproduct processing plants. Oils and pigments could be extracted too. White grapes would be crushed but not destemmed and allowed to sit with the skins for 6 to 10 hours before the juice was drawn off. The remaining pomace would be pressed and the pressed juice kept separate. Small oak casks would be filled about 2/3 full. Every day the foam skimmed off, and when the fermentation had passed its peak, the casks would be nearly topped up and plugged with fermentation bungs or small sandbags, which was the Italian way, according to him. Cellars should be about 60 degrees when possible and dark, showing why the CWA stayed in San Francisco so long and then to Winehaven directly on the water. He also liked how wines cleared quicker in the cold. The first racking would usually be 6 to 10 weeks after the wine was made. Again, between February and April, before the weather started to warm up and sediment and lees could get stirred up by a fermentation or malolactic finishing up, and then racked again in August or September. Wines that hadn't shown improvement were set aside for longer or to be distilled. After this last racking, everything would be brought to the main cellars from the country wineries to be blended. He would often perfect the blend using samples and then request shipments of the wines to be blended in. Lachman gives us the general preference here for some different markets they ship to. Quote, "For England, a Burgundy type is blended. For China and Japan, a Bordeaux type. New Orleans uses a wine more on the line of vin ordinaire. New York takes various Burgundy types and light clarets, as well as strong, stringent wines for the Italians," unquote. They had a special device for making blends where up to 10 tanks could be accessed at once to fill a 250,000-gallon tank with their preferred blend. They would make 4 blends of 250,000 gallons, and then reblend these to create a 1 million-gallon blend. This would be allowed to rest for 90 days and then filtered and afterwards fined using egg whites and or gelatin for the reds. Between 6 and 12 egg whites would be used per 100 gallons. White wines would be fined with Russian isinglass made from the dried swim bladders of sturgeon. After clarification was complete, the wines would be analyzed for alcohol, sugar, and volatile acidity. Lackman laments that the U.S. had no regulations for wine when it came to these measurements. Other countries did, though, and the CWA would ensure that the wines would pass the test of any of them. Wines that didn't would be condemned and sent to the distillery. Whites generally averaged 11.5% alcohol, and red 12.5% in his experience. To avoid flattening the wine, Lackman stressed that wine should never be overly filtered. Tasting, of course, is what made Lackman famous, and he gives his technique for tasting and judging wines. Quote, "In tasting, there is the first taste, the second taste, and the goodbye after the wine has left the mouth. On the first taste, the body or extract is detected. On the second taste, the tannins, free and acidic, and on the goodbye, the tannin, flavor, and defects are caught. The musty taste is not noticed until fully half a minute after the mouth is dried." Unquote. Unlike earlier in his career, Lackman advocates for chemical analysis as well. Quote, "Which should be assisted by chemical analysis, as it is the only check showing that the taster is correct in his judgment. A taster should never attempt to judge wines if he is out of condition. An experienced taster should be able to tell the alcohol, extract, and free and volatile acids to detect any blemish and tell whether a wine has been corrected by the use of lime, chalk, or salt. This requires constant practice. There are so many tests to make on wines that comparatively few can be made in the laboratory if each sample is to be analyzed for all its ingredients." Unquote. He touches on the bottling of wines and how to tell when they are safe to be shipped, as well as making sherry, port, Malaga, and other styles of wine. It gives a great insight into how wine was handled at the turn of the century. The techniques and grapes are sometimes still used today, and other thoughts were abandoned long ago. Lackman would also write a short history of his early industry experience for the International Congress of Viticulture. In it, he discusses how Bordeaux wines would be shipped in the cargo hold of French ships headed for San Francisco as ballast. These ships would unload their wine cargo in order to reload the ship with grain going to France. Sometimes empty bottles and corks would make the trip too, packed in straw. The French wines would be blended with ones from California and bottled, usually by whiskey dealers. What started as 50-50 would over time become 80% California, 20% French. And then the French would disappear altogether as wine firms took over and the quality of California wines improved. In these early-ish days, the mid-1870s to early 1890s, Lackman remembers Albert Tubbs of Napa bringing back Merlot, Becklin, and Cabernet vines. They would ferment each individually, using a screen destemmer and a barrel for fermentation in order to note the differences. They would do the same in making what were called the Sauterne-type blends of Sauvignon Blanc, Semillon, and Muscatel de Bordelais that was so popular at the time. They would always use a beam-style press, which still had some popularity left. He also advocates for the mission grape, which at this point around 1915 was rarely done. He notes that the only wine that they couldn't produce with it was a claret type, and that the Angelica is unequaled, the sherry good, and as a white wine, would take on interesting German wine characteristics. We've seen it in other episodes, but Lackman also bemoans the fact that people release their wines too early and that customers drink them too quickly, and when given age, they can turn into great wines. Quote, "It seems a pity that the old fashion of private cellars and setting aside wines to mature has gone out of date." Unquote. Lackman presumably would have been very involved in setting aside those reserve bottles that the CWA intended to age at least 10 years before release, the ones that were destroyed in the earthquake and fire. He finishes up hoping that the finer qualities of wines will be taken more seriously, while also showing unease about prohibition. Almond Raleigh Morrow, or A.R. Morrow, was Henry Lackman's assistant and would take his place at the CWA. His tasting ability was said to be nearly equal to both Lackman and Carpi. He would control the wine side of the CWA until Prohibition. We're only going to focus on Morrow's wine superintendent work and tasting here. He had a long and storied career that we glanced at last episode, and at some point we'll further investigate how he became the grand old man. He was born December 11th, 1862 in Georgetown. That's in El Dorado County in the Sierra foothills, not far from where gold was first discovered in California. The town's nickname was Growlersburg, and I've seen the origin of that name described two ways. I suppose it could be both. The first is the sound the large pieces of the rough quartz, sparkling with gold, which were common in the area, made in the miners' pockets as they would grind together. The second is the straightforwardness, matter-of-fact way, and sometimes acidic tongue of its citizens. The goldfields were still earning when he was born, and the camp would eventually produce $32 million worth of gold. As a child, he would watch the dejected James Marshall, the man who discovered gold in California, at his blacksmith shop in the nearby town of Kelsey. Marshall had relocated here after being chased off his claims. Morrow's introduction to the wine industry was as an internal revenue gauger. This was someone who would measure the gallonage and proof of alcohol. Using a bung rod, measurements would be conducted of the barrel, and then the rod dipped into the barrel to calculate the amount of product. After also measuring the alcohol percentage, it could be determined the amount of water to add and the taxes due. For a single year, he was the secretary to the American consul of Nice, and then it was back to the U.S. Kohler and Froling was his first true wine industry job, where he worked the scales. Soon enough, he was over to S. Lackman & Co., where he trained under Henry Lackman in tasting and grading wines. He went with the Lackmans when the CWA started and took over from Lackman in 1902 as general superintendent. By 1915, he was general manager. He would become head of production for the newly reformed CWA coming out of Prohibition. Morrow would often go around the state as part of the CWA, tasting wines in cellars large and small that they had contracted with or controlled. He would taste and classify all the wines, evaluating where they would fit into the CWA program. Although some of the larger firms had their own, often competing brands with the CWA, many more were smaller cellars that acted as bulk wineries. Here's from Leon Adams, the great historian and Wine Institute leader. Quote, Morrow told me his methods of tasting, that he preferred to taste at an hour when he was hungry. He knew that his taste was keenest at that particular point. He would never eat highly seasoned foods. He did not smoke, and he would never swallow any wine. He told me, however, that when Prohibition became the law, he swallowed his first glass of wine, thinking there was no more to his career. And he was amazed to discover that this did not affect his ability to taste. I can testify to that fact." Unquote. I've also seen an alternate version of that particular story, both from reputable sources. They don't have to necessarily be mutually exclusive either. It goes that he was tasting brandy on the day that the Prohibition vote came down. While smelling the spirit, his secretary came in to read the telegram. To the surprise of everyone, he downed the shot in one go. Who knows, maybe he had his first glass of wine after that. Adams accompanied Morrow on a tasting trip shortly before the repeal of Prohibition, specifically to see what his tasting process was like. The first stop was a winery near Oakville, later owned by the Trefethen family. The winemaker had met with Morrow for many years, and the process was pretty routine. With his thief, he drew out a couple glasses of the new vintage of Zinfandel. Morrow scribbled down notes in a book, spitting the wine and providing guidance on what could be done with it. It was on to Calistoga next to visit the Napa Valley Co-op, where, again, some wine was drawn off, a notebook and spitting, telling the winemaker he thought it should be racked soon. He would only have a light breakfast on tasting days, maybe a small cup of coffee and a piece of toast, and would avoid the anchovies, cheese, and olives he was offered from the wine growers. There was no romance involved here. He didn't want to know any more than necessary about the wines he was tasting. He could be old-timey and well-mannered, but pulled no punches with his wine judgment, perhaps from his Growlersburg upbringing. Despite the protests of his workmen, most of whom were recent European immigrants, he would bottle wines when it was raining, hot, cloudy, windy, freezing. He had them go ahead. There's a story that Morrow could tell how much of the mortgage was still on the vineyard by how overcropped he felt it was, or if it seemed like too much hard-pressed wine was included. In later years, it was said he would refuse to taste a wine if he detected a flaw on the nose. As vice president of fruit industries, he would still be out tasting well into his 80s, taking notes in his black bowler hat. Charles Ashe would be Morrow's assistant also. When Ashe went on his first solo tasting trip, Morrow gave him words of advice that would stick with the young chemist his entire life. Quote, "No doubt you will see things that don't please you, that aren't scientific. But please remember this. Some of these older men have made good wines before you were born, and if you cannot show them a better way of doing things, do not criticize." Unquote. Ashe would try and see and balance both the scientific and artistic side of winemaking after that. Lackman was at first unimpressed when finding out that Ashe could test alcohol, volatile acidity, total acidity, extract, etc., but couldn't tell him if a wine was good or not from those results. Quote, "All right, after you have these results, can you tell me if a wine is good or bad? Can you tell its quality? Will it stand shipment? I can tell all these things just by tasting a wine. What do I need a chemist for?" Unquote. As we've seen with time, Lackman would come to value Ashe. Ashe and others would provide stories of Lackman's tasting prowess. Like how Lackman could go through 100 samples of wine, classifying them, and do it again later in the day with upwards of 90% receiving the same ranking. Others of him tasting a random wine at the exposition and correctly calling it a Santa Clara wine. Ashe provided more behind-the-scenes details of 1890s winemaking. Quote, "Each wine company had its secret. For example, in one house, the filter was kept under lock and key. They had imported so-called French filters. What were these French filters? Just wooden filter presses. What was the filter medium used? Lees. The lees was painted on the filtering cloth." Unquote. Ashe also discovered salicylic acid was used as a common preservative in wine. This was before the pure food and drug laws were passed. He was able to help improve wines in a real way with his chemistry skills. Quote, "Most of the wine was fermented at high temperatures. There were practically no coolers. The only cooling was done by aeration, and in consequence, there was much sugar left in the wines when shipped. Such wines were attacked by microorganisms and of course spoiled. By determining the sugar content, we were able to predict which wines were subject to spoilage after shipment and which were not. No host, no spoilage. I do not remember the exact percentage of spoiled or semi-spoiled wines in that era, but I would say that it was at least 50% would be considered so by today's standards. By 1905, this percentage was reduced to less than 0.5% in the wines made by the association." Unquote. With all of the tasting accomplishments bestowed upon Lackman and Morrow, Jocelyn Maynard from the university actually thought Ashe might be the best taster. Better than Morrow, at least. In a strange turn, Maynard thought Ashe could outguess the chemists when it came to the ability for a product to sell or match a certain quality level.
No, I've tasted wine with Morrow. And
Have you?
Yeah, both at the State Fair and the other tastings, and I don't think his sense of taste was particularly acute or discriminating. Because you see, in the old days, the person who had an excellent sense of taste was the Charlie Ashe, who was the chemist for the California Wine Association. And Charlie Ashe actually parlayed his ability to taste and wine into a very good job with the California Packing Corporation, because he had a remarkable sense of taste for various products. He could actually taste tomato ketchup, sauces, and other products, and determine by taste alone whether they would sell and whether they met the standards for the quality that were used by the California Packing Corporation. That you could actually outguess the chemist in the chemical laboratory. In the first place, the methodology of wine tasting and the technique of sensory evaluation of wine was not as highly developed before Prohibition as it is now, because before Prohibition, wine tasters operated more like whiskey tasters or tea or coffee tasters. Today, as a result of the development of the techniques of sensory evaluation of beer by the brewery interests in Europe, we have highly sophisticated methods of appraising the sensory properties of wine and evaluating wines than we did before. Today we actually can detect whether a person has the ability to recall the taste sensations of wine, whether his ability to select one wine from the other by a completely controlled statistical analysis of his ability to select one out of three wines, samples of wine that is presented. We can test the tester. This was not possible before the passage of the 18th Amendment or shortly after its repeal. These techniques were developed during the war in the attempt to produce army rations of more acceptable quality. And the whole methodology of taste difference testing was developed during the war. So that there is the carryover of the sophisticated brewery appraisal of beer and the methodology of the sensory evaluation of foods introduced during the war to modern wine tasting or taste appraisal, so that it's very difficult to discriminate between the romantic accolades given to people like A.R. Morrow and reproducible discriminatory tastings of the kind that occur today, because we didn't have any means to actually check on him. Furthermore, it wasn't the rule among California wine appraisers and tasters to periodically subject themselves to blind tasting of the type that I found in Australia during the war. The Australian Wine Association periodically conducted tastings, and what happened is that a vintner would be even given his own wine against an imported wine, which he would taste blind. The good taster in Sydney and Melbourne were able to always detect their wines from the others. Some of the others actually condemned the product, which they, much to their surprise, at the end of the tasting, found to be their own. I don't know how acute A.R. Morrow's sense of taste was. Don't forget that by 1933 or 4, he was already old, and as a person's age, their taste acuity decreases, and their ability to taste wines actually decreases also. There's their ability to consistently taste the number of samples of wine is reduced.
I want to bring back our old friend Sidney Block also. He was, of course, based in New Orleans and can describe the wines that he was selling there better than I could.
We had a wine that is now just beginning to find its way around the country in proper form, or I should say, in its true state as to the real name of the wine. Many years gone by, at Petaluma, Mr. Sam Ciprico, who was the manager of the Lockman and Jacoby plant up there, he had some wine up there that he didn't think was possibly could be used in other sections of the country, and he sent us down a sample, and it was a light pink wine, and it resembles the Italian wines that we used on the barrels brands such as Vino Sicilia, which is Sicilian type, and Vino Scelto, which means good wine, Vino d'Asti, and we sold this to the Italian trade for years and years. And funny as it may seem, and I want to say this about my good friend Leon Adams, he came to New Orleans one trip. He was making a survey for Mr. Eddie Gallo, and he came to my office and he said, Sid, I'm making a survey for Eddie Gallo on rosé. And I said, well, Leon, I'd be very happy to bring you a rosé that I've been selling down here for years and years and years and years. And he said, you have? And I said, yes. He said, what is it? Sweet Vito. And when I brought it to him, he was amazed. The sample, he was amazed. He said, well, I never believed it. Now, this vino is practically the same as the blend of rosé that's made today. Well, I don't mean the high premium wines. Now, I'm talking of vin ordinaire. And so I've been selling that, and we're still selling it in the New Orleans market. Frankly, 99% of the markets in the United States don't know sweet vino. However, lately, Mr. Gallo has started a sweet vino label in my market. However, he's got a different wine. And Swiss Colony's got a sweet vino. But the sweet vino was really primarily a New Orleans deal that was sold to the Italian trade, sweetened up a little bit. And it was the equivalent of really, if you would be drinking rosé today, you couldn't tell it. In fact, Leon was surprised. Just about 1 degree in sugar sweeter, that's about all. Yeah, not very much. Rosé is a all-purpose wine. It's a light wine. And we sold that as far back, pre-Prohibition days. Yes, and Leon Adams thought it was very interesting, and he said, I can't believe it. When I went out and purchased 2 bottles, or brought in to my office 2 bottles to show him. I really say openly that I think Lachman Jacobi, while they didn't call it rosé, they turned out the wine, which is, I'd say, the next thing to the word rosé.
Antonio Pirelli Manetti, who we mentioned earlier, also has great insight into the winemaking of the Italian Swiss colony and the CWA. He has another story here of how he got his new job and a promotion. We'll have a full episode on him at some point. His story is one of the best around.
It was quite a large place. We had a fermenting room there that was a brand new one that built the year before, would accommodate 5,000 tons of grapes in one pond. But the operation of Asti, aside for the crushing of Asti, was the different people that were contributors to Asti. It was Patronac, all those small wineries in Sonoma County that made wine and delivered to Asti. So Asti was quite a large place, several million gallons capacity. They had 1 tank after 1 million gallons. I thought it was a good wine, yes, very good. It was large. When the 10 Swiss colony was incorporated and they built the first winery, they made 100,000 gallons. First wine that was 100,000 gallons. And he was from Switzerland. So they told me that the story went over there, that in Switzerland they had to close the wine and put the fire in because otherwise the so-called won't ferment. And this fellow did the same thing over there in Asti. So he made the vinegar. I went there in 1902, I left there in 19. And that's a little history to the case. When I went there that was when the crushing season started. Mr. Rossi, I think was in August. So we employed a fellow, and that's another name I can't forget. His name is Shirley Black. As a weight master.
Weight master, oh, excuse me.
So Mr. Ross and Mr. Cyber were together, and I think Mr. Crawford was there too. I don't remember who else was there anyway. And so I went to Mr. Ross. I said, Mr. Ross, I have a man by the name of Shirley Black, but nobody's given me how much I have to credit him for the wages. So Mr. Rossi says to me, he says, under $25 a month, you know, they're Americans, and if we don't pay them good wages, so we'll be criticized. I said to myself, I'm in the wrong church. I'm getting $75 a month because I'm Italian, and the other fellow's getting under 25. So Mr. Rossi must have seen the muscle in my face, but I didn't say anything. So he was going to Italy. I said, keep still. So when Mr. Rossi came back from Italy, I told him that on the vacation I was going to go. And then that day Mr. Ross came back from Italy. He came up to Asti, that was in February, with Percy Morgan, Mrs. Morgan, and Mr. Art Morrow of the California Associations. And they came by the winery, and it was a little chilly. And Mr. Ross asked me if I had an overcoat for Mrs. Morgan. I had one of those, what they call pipistrelli, was coat and then the cape and the hood made of camel hair, just long hair. So I handed to Mr. Ross, and Mrs. Morgan put it on. So they went down to Chianti, and when they came back, it was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So Mr. Morrow, he was a young fellow then, but after this big cart there, with the 3 seats, with the 2 horses, and he came down and he said to me, Mrs. Morgan wants to buy your coat. So I said, no, my coat is not for sale. Well, I had the idea in my mind to get away from, to resign my position with Fizz, because I resented the fact that I won, because he was an American, he was getting, and I said to myself, if I got to work for Americans, if Americans feel the same way, I'm the one that gets benefited. So I said to Mr. Morrow, say, no, it will not sell, and I will not sell it. And I said to Mr. Morgan, I said, Mr. Morrow asked me to sell this coat. The coat is not for sale, but if you wish to accept as a present from me, I'll be very happy. So she said yes. And so Mr. Morrow said to me, says, anytime you want a new job, come and see me. I said, well, it is done already. So I said to Mr. Morrow, I said, I'll be coming to see you next week. So I got the job with Mr. Morrow.
Charles Carpy was also recognized as having a wonderful palate. He conceded that much of it was experience and to be able to recognize good, bad, or indifferent after being shown, and to make comparisons and remember the qualities of wines tasted. He would list the qualities that to him made a fine wine. Quote, first, it should be brilliant. Second, it should appeal to the sense of taste. It should be clean. Its vinosity should be pronounced. After tasting, it should leave upon the palate the clear, definite impression of cleanliness. Third, it should appeal very strongly to the sense of smell. The bouquet should be unimpeachable. Fourth, it should be served and tasted under proper conditions. Any wine that leaves the drinker in the condition of, oh, I don't want any more, is not a fine wine, no matter how much it may appeal to the sense of sight, taste, and smell, unquote. Klaus Schilling was another of the renowned tasters. He was the one we saw way back at the beginning of this series, purchasing only the cream of the crop of wines, but happy to pay more for them. Horace Lanza, who supplied that story, and this one, is another man we'll get to in time. Here's Lanza describing Schilling's wines in a tasting competition.
He told me once that they had a display of wines in the city, and they had committees of wine men to judge these wines. He displayed some white wines, and he got the first prize. That is, they were accepted as the best, the first prize. But there was a gentleman that lived on the peninsula, some wealthy man, and had just a small winery of his own for his pleasure. He displayed some of his wines at this show place. Mr. Schilling said, I tasted those wines. Those were better than mine. He said, and the judges had given the flag for the second prize to this gentleman. The first was to Mr. Schilling, and they gave the rating another wine. I said, Mr. Schilling, what'd you do that for? He says, Jesus Christ, didn't I show those judges I knew more about wine than they did? Do you get it? You can see the type of a man he was.
There's no word on what the judge's reaction was.
He was a very fair and a fellow full of the Dickens, in turn. When he told me at one time, he used to buy wines from a German
at Cordelia who owned Mangles, was the Mangles Winery. He said Mangles made pretty good wines. One year he went to him, said, I knew that the price of wine was going to go up, so I thought I'd have some fun with Mangles. His name was Klaus also, Klaus Mangles. So when he went and saw the wines, they came down to the price, said, all right, Mangles, now these past years I have always told you what I would pay you. This year, I'm going to let you fix the price. Well, he said, you know, last year you paid me 8 cents a gallon. He says, I think I ought to get 8 cents a gallon again this year. All right, that's fair enough. That's what you say, and it'll be 8 cents a gallon. He got through with him, went up the road, and he stopped at another winery owned by a gentleman, of Mr. Wheeler. He had been commissioner of agriculture for the state or something like that in the agricultural department, Mr. Wheeler. And he went through the winery, tasted the wines, then he said, I'm going to let you fix your price this year. Well, he says, well, what are you paying? He said, well, I'm not going to make any price, but I'll tell you, I just left the winery of Mangles, and I bought that at 8 cents. Well, he said, you paid 8 cents to Mangles, the same. I want the same. I said, okay, if you're satisfied. He said, I knew that the price was too low. So after the market broke, so it was all very well known, the price had gone up 2 or 3 cents, whatever it was. And both got sold, Mangles and Wheeler, because, they had been caught. He said to Mangles, he says, Klaus, what the hell are you talking about? Didn't I leave it to you to make the price? Are you sore that at yourself? Why do you blame me? Well, he went away. He was rather dissatisfied. The following year, he went again to Mangles, and he said, now listen, the price this year is going to be 10 cents, but I'm going to pay you 12 to make up to him.
I enjoy hearing these stories of the actual cellars and people making the wines, blending them, and who's responsible for what the customer was drinking. CWA was a big business, and it's easy to get lost in the millions of gallons of wine and forget about the people growing the grapes or making the wines. Thanks for listening today and to the rest of the series. I really hope you enjoyed it. It was more research than I ever intended to do. It started out as a shortish episode on Winehaven, but then how do you tell that without the earthquake and some background on the CWA and all these details of this pre-Prohibition wine history? There's still a ton of other good stories to be told. I'm looking forward to it. Some episodes that connect to this series are episode 40 on the two Natoma vineyards. One of them was a huge source for CWA wines, but the history is much more interesting than that. Episode 29 on Mission San Jose and Fremont wine history. This is where the Gallegos winery that Henry Lackman purchased was located, and we discuss it in depth. And episodes 24 and 26 on the university experiment stations. The stations were happening at the same time as the CWA was building up power and fighting the wine wars. They helped to supply the vineyard and winemaking knowledge. Most of the other historical ones have some sort of tie-in also, like John and Frank Sweat in episode 35, or Christopher Buckley in episode 42. He owned one of these country wineries that would sell wine to the CWA. Also, a big thank you to Gail Unzelman, who personally boxed up and sent me a copy of her and Ernest Pennenu's book on the CWA when I was unable to access some library archives because of a closure for reorganizing. It's an amazing book, rarely available, and many sell it on the secondary market for super high prices, more than I can afford. She was kind enough to send me a copy of it and a couple of her other books quicker than I could have imagined in order that more people could learn about California wine history. It for sure made these episodes better and helped fill in some question marks, so for that I'm super thankful. You can follow the podcast on wherever you're listening and the Instagram at IndieWinePodcast, and feel free to email indiewinepodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or feedback. If you can tell your wine friends about the podcast too and help spread the word, I'd really appreciate it. Rating or subscribing helps too. There's also a Patreon if you choose to support the podcast monetarily to allow for more episodes and to help defray other costs like travel, research book purchases, things like that. Any amount is appreciated. I have a small token of my appreciation to send to you also if you do. The link is in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode. Have a good one.